Greetings and salutations. Thanks for clicking on the video. Today we're going to talk about the Linux file system. This is not a comprehensive video, and hopefully it will not be very technical. This is just for anybody who is curious about what is different with the Linux Unix file system compared to like what you might be used to working with in Windows or Macintosh or other devices. And it does have its idiosyncrasies, mainly because of the fact that the Linux file system comes from Unix, and Unix is the granddaddy of all operating systems, which was originally designed for computers that lived in, that filled up a whole room and had hundreds of users attached to them and all sorts of different storage all over the place and tape drives and things like that. So we're using this system today on our little laptops and our little desktops that have maybe 1 or 2 hard drives in them, but we still get all the functionality for these big gargantuan systems of years ago. And the first thing that I guess we need to do is clear up just a little bit of confusion. We need to define the word file system in the sense that we're talking about it today, because there are 2 meanings to that word. File system can refer to the format that you put on a hard drive, the way the hard drive itself actually stores files. And you'll hear people say, well, I had to format the hard drive and install a new file system. In Windows, there are file systems like FAT32 and NTFS. In Linux, there are a number of file systems. The de facto is ext4, but there's ext3 and ext2 and JFS and XFS and ButterFS and many more to choose from. The average user, though, really doesn't care about what file system is being used on their hard drive as long as it works. And ext4 is one of the most stable and best in the world, so it's a good de facto choice. Today, what we're talking about is a file system in the sense of how an individual computer organizes data, where it stores it, and how it keeps up with where it is. So we're looking at a diagram here of a basic file system for a Linux machine and all of the different folders or directories that appear. If you're working at a command line, we call them directories, because a directory is actually a file that holds a bunch of addresses for other files. In computer science class, they compared those to file folders that held more files. That was the common way it was taught. So therefore, when GUIs came along, the graphic user environments with file managers, directories were represented by file folders, so today we actually call them folders. They're interchangeable. Alright, so now that we have our nomenclature all figured out, let's get into this. Oh, we have another one here that's a dual meaning to talk about, and that is the root of the file system. Not to be confused with the root user, who is the one person on a Linux or Unix system who has complete control over the system, okay? In this case, we're talking about the root of the file system, the base, the start, the top, the beginning, and it is represented by a single slash. Now, under here, you'll see all of these different directories and folders and all this other stuff, and the entire computer is in here, because in Linux and Unix, everything is represented by a file or a folder. Every device on your computer is represented by a file or a folder. Your hard drives, your display, your keyboard, your everything is actually represented by a file or a folder. Also, you can have numerous hard drives hooked up to a Linux computer, and you're going to notice immediately there are no A's, B's, C's, and D's. In Windows, you can have more than one partition on one physical drive, and that will be put as different drives on the machine, A, B, C, D, whatever. In Linux and Unix, what you do is you mount that hard drive in a folder somewhere, an empty folder, so it could appear anywhere in the file system, and you could have as many hard drives as you wanted. You can also take network shares and mount them to the file system in different folders, and that way you don't care where the data is coming from. All you care is that you have access to it. That's called obfuscation, and it makes sense when you have very complex systems. So let's actually take a look at some of the folders that you will find on your computer, and to do that I'm going to open up a actual file manager here. In this case, since we're using Ubuntu, it's called Files, or Nautilus is the actual name of the program that does this. And we're in our home folder, and we see our typical folders, and you see that I've created some more folders in here. And if you want to see all of the files that are on the system, in Ubuntu you have an entry down here. It says computer, and now it lets me see pretty much the same thing that we're seeing here with a few added things. So let's go ahead and take a look in here and talk about a few of these folders. I'm not going to get too deep into this. I'm just going to point out some of the ones that are the more important ones. Bin stands for binary. This is where all of the programs live on the machine, or most of them. The boot folder is actually where all of the files live that the kernel needs to boot the machine, and your bootloader lives here as well. That is a system folder you don't have access to. CD-ROM is from the early days of when you had CD-ROM devices on computers. And this is where somebody could find the CD-ROM when they plopped a CD into it. This is now basically just a legacy folder that's left in here for compatibility because your DVD drives and CD drives and everything show up in the media folder these days. Dev is all of the devices on the computer. Remember, everything, like your keyboard, your mouse, whatever, is represented by a file or a folder. So this is where they are. Here's an important folder, which is etc. This holds all sorts of configuration files for the system. And sometimes you actually have to go in here and find a file and change something in it. And this is why etc. is important. Also, it's the etc. directory, but people call it etc. or etc. The home folder, which in this case is an example of a hard drive that is mounted to the system. All of the stuff in the home folder actually lives in a separate drive on this particular system, although you can't tell by looking in the file system. And this is where all of the users' files live in their home directories. Okay? And this is where it comes up by default. It will open up when you open a file manager and you're logged into your account. That's where you are. When you open a terminal, you are automatically in your home folder. Lib and lib64 are where libraries live. They are like DLLs in Windows, and it's basically information that programs use on the computer. 4 programs can use the same library, so therefore they're stored separately. The media folder is very important with the Ubuntu desktop and GNOME desktop and many of the other modern Linux desktops, because here is where, when you plug in a USB drive, this is where it's going to show up. It's going to automatically mount itself in media. Anything that mounts in media, I didn't mean to do that. Anything that mounts in media will show up on your desktop or over here in your dash as a drive. For instance, I have a hard drive that is on this machine that automatically mounts at startup, and it shows up here, and it's mounted in the media directory. Get back to where I was, please. Thank you. Optional. The opt directory is where some programs are stored. Like, for instance, here we have Google Chrome and TeamViewer, which are proprietary programs available for Linux. This is where a lot of those go, and it's just optional software. Of course, the temp directory is the same thing as TMP, stands for temporary, and that's where temporary files are stored. Usually that directory is cleared out when you reboot your system, or you can use programs to clean that out. By the way, everything except the home folder here, you have to have administrator privileges to access. We're allowed to look, but we can't touch unless we actually have administrator privileges to do so. Another important folder is var. This is where a lot of logs and temporary files for the system are stored. This is variable data, and you'll find all kinds of stuff in here, like caches, backups, just all kinds of stuff goes into the var directory. Some administrators actually choose to put that on a separate partition on the hard drive as well. SBIN is more binaries usually used by the system, so here's where a lot of your commands live. The root folder, and remember we have the root of the file system, which is represented by the slash, and then we have the root folder. This is where the root user's home directory is. So if you actually have a root user account activated on your Linux system, this is where you would find all of the root users stuff that would be in the home directory. Sys, temp, let's see if there's anything else in here to talk about. SRV, universal system resources. Sometimes things like icons for your desktop are stored here, all kinds of crazy things that the desktop uses or other programs use that can be used by many different users on the computer end up in there. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, go look in the USR folder. The user, some people say that's the user folder. It's not, it's Universal System Resources. So there's a quick look around the file system. Mainly you're going to be working in your home folder. That's where you're going to be all the time, unless you have to do something else to the system. You're trying to customize it, you're trying to modify it, or troubleshoot a problem. Working in the file system is actually quite easy, and we're going to do this with the GUI. You can do all of this with the terminal. There are commands, but I'm not going to do any of it with a command today to prove a point, because one of the common misconceptions about Linux is that, oh, you got to open a terminal all the time to do everything. No, you don't. I mean, some things you do, but some things you have to do that in Windows and Mac too. So we're going to work here in the terminal, and I created a new folder. It says untitled folder at this point, and I'm going to give it a new file name. I'm going to give it something creative like junk, because we're just going to create some files to play around with, and we'll open that up and we have a nice empty folder. To create new files, simply right click and choose new document, and it will create an empty file. We're going to call this one test, and there you go. Now, one of the interesting things about the Linux file system is that it is case sensitive. In other words, a lowercase t and an uppercase T are different. So therefore, I can create a file that looks like this. And as you can see, it pops right up. It exists. I can keep that going. Let's create another one. This presents problems when you're sharing files with a Windows file system, because the Windows file system is not case sensitive. It doesn't really care. Now, they do have an extension that allows you to name files with upper and lowercase letters, so it shows up in the GUI and all that other stuff. But if you tried to send these files to a Windows file system, it would get confused, and it would do all kinds of goofiness. So keep this in mind if you're creating files that will end up on a Windows file system. To rename a file, all we do is press F2, and then we can do that. We can also choose it from the menu. So we're going to call this one test 1. And let's see, we're going to rename the file, and this time around I'll choose it from the menu to show you that it does the same thing. Test 2. Oh, actually I'm going to rename that again because I called it Yest. Why didn't anybody tell me I did that? Gee. Thank you. Now we don't look like so much of an idiot. Alright, so we have our 3 files. Another thing that you need to understand about the Linux file system is how it will actually hide a file. So if we go back into our home folder, let's go back into home here, we see that we have these folders, but you may know that all of your system settings and everything about your particular account live in this folder. So where is it? Well, let me show you where it is. If I use the Control key and the letter H, I am now looking at hidden files. In Linux, files are hidden by placing a dot in front of the file name. So if you want to create a file and you don't want it to be automatically seen, this is how you would do it. So we have all of this stuff in here outside of the folders that we normally see, and these files contain configuration files mainly. So if I open this and we take a look at it, which is a configuration file for a program called Asunder, which is a CD music ripper, you see this is where all of that configuration is. If you know what you're doing, you can edit this file and then you can change the configuration without using a GUI. And sometimes that is a cool way to do things. Also, here's the picture for my account that's here. And let's see what else is in here that we can look at. Bash history is an important file. We will open that with, let's do this with, actually, I'm going to do it with gedit. Thank you. That's a little bit lighter weight in application. And you can see here, this contains a list of all of the commands that I have ever typed into the terminal when I was working on the computer. So I have access to those. And in the terminal itself, to access a list of the commands that I have used, then all I do is use the arrow keys to go up, and there you go. So that's where that is stored. So all of this information lives in here. So let's go back to our junk folder, and let's go ahead and hide the file, the first file here. I'm going to F2 to change its name, and we're going to retype it with a, I'll just call it .hide. You have renamed the file. Sometimes you have to do this twice to get it to take. And this is actually something that's easier to do in the terminal. It's kind of like you have to do it twice so the system knows that you really mean it. Alright, in a moment here, that file is just simply going to disappear. We won't see it because we started it. If I jump back out here and then go back in, you'll see, well, now it's gone. To see it again, Control H, and there is the file. So this is how you would create a hidden file or folder. Now, Samba, which is a program that allows you to share files with Windows machines, will actually interpret this. And it can, I don't know whether this is on by default, but if you put a file on your Windows machine, it will set the hidden attribute. So it tries to keep the different attributes of the files the same, which can cause even more confusion. So if you're moving a hidden file over to a Windows machine and you see it just disappears, that means that in Windows the hidden attribute on the file was actually set when Samba transferred it over. Of course, having all these different file names that can have the same text or the same capitals and mixed cases in Linux does present a problem in Windows as well. I think I've already mentioned that. Okay, so we have learned about what files are and how to name them, and of course everything else is pretty straightforward if you're working in the graphic user environment. If you want to move a file, I want to put it out on the desktop, I drag it, and then there it goes, and that sort of thing. That's all pretty simple and straightforward. Now, if we move a file between two drives, we might not know because of the way that the Linux system obfuscates the different partitions on a hard drive or different physical devices. And if we move from one partition to another, we're going to copy the file and not move it. So if you do that and you see that happen and you go, well, the file, I thought I was moving it, then that's why. In this case, when I move this file out to the desktop like this, then we're actually just moving it from one directory or folder to another. I will show you one terminal command because it is extremely useful. And it's one that you can get a lot of use out of if you're managing files on the system. And this is going to be the one I'm going to hold myself to. And that is, I'm going to show you the touch command. So let's first of all go to the directory that we're playing around in, which is junk. This little tilde here represents my home directory, so it lets me know that I am in home. So if I want to go back to home, I can always do CD and then a tilde, like so, and then it'll automatically take me back to my home directory. If you want to know what directory you're working in, present just type in present working directory or print working directory, PWD, and it'll tell you, and it tells me I'm in home. So anyway, and like I said, we can go back and get files, get commands by just doing that. So anyhow, so let me show you this command. I'm in the junk folder. So we're going to use touch to create a bunch of files. And we'll call it file 1, file 2, file 3, file 4. Okay, so I'm just going to create a whole bunch of files. And they showed up here. Now, what good is the touch command? Well, it does the same thing as right-clicking and choosing Create Empty Document. Okay, so it'll create an empty file. I don't even know what to call this one at this point. Who cares? But it will do it in batches, so that's kind of cool. If you use the touch command against a file that already exists on the system, then it will change the modification date of that file. So that can be very useful when you want to back up a whole directory of files. You want to make sure that the backup program says, okay, this has changed and I need to make a copy of it. That's how you can do it, is using the touch command. The touch command can also be used to create flag files, which means that it's a file with a certain name that tells the system to do something when the system sees it. So it can be a very useful little command, and that's the only one I'm going to show you. All right, since we were creating files, I thought about it. Now the next thing we need to talk about is file permissions before we wrap this video up, because this is very important in Linux. To get to it through the GUI, we would go to Properties out of the drop-down menu there, and then we would choose File Permissions. I created the file, so therefore I own the file. I am the owner. I have, since I am the owner, complete access. I may read and write this file. People who are in my group is called Joe. If I should choose to include other users on the system in that group, they will have access to the file and they will be able to read and write it as well. Others, this is anybody that can see the files on the system. They can only see it. They can only read it. And in this case, this means that they can do nothing with it. It's just that they can see it. Now, if this is a file that contains private information and I want to be the only person who actually can see it, then I can change these permissions to none, which means that I'm the only person. And if I'm so paranoid that I myself don't even want to write to the file, I can change it to read only. Down here, this will allow me to execute the file as a program, which means that when I click on it, the system will try and actually run the file as a program. This is useful if you're creating script files. In other words, you are writing your own little programs to tell the computer to do different things. You would create the file, and then you would give it executable status here. And when you did that, that would mean that if you ran it in a terminal or clicked on it, that it would actually run. So those are what the permissions mean. You can screw up the permissions in such a way that you can give nobody access. And if that happens, then you'll have to log in as the super user to delete everything that's in the system. Or all of those files, not everything that's in the system. Why would you want to do that? Hey, you just blew up the whole town, man. Nothing works now. Dang, you have to reinstall. Okay. So we're about to wrap this video up. I think I've pretty much covered all of the basic stuff here and all of the differences between the Linux file system and the other file systems out there. Go ahead and make it so we can't see the files, and then we are going to remove this directory and get back to normal. So I hope that was an interesting introduction. I know that I have left a great deal of stuff out, but it gives you a basic idea of how the Linux file system works, and most of it is the same as what you're dealing with, but there are some differences that every now and again you run across and you go, huh? What was that all about? So thank you for watching the video. Love to hear from you. Comments are always welcome, and don't forget to check out the link below to easylinux.com if you want me to help you get started with Linux and get off on the right foot and have a good experience with the Linux system. Thanks for watching.